Who has had a good week, Dominic?
Well, I thought it was a good week to talk about what's been going on politically in my home country of the Netherlands, because it's been rather a dramatic week. So 11 months after forming a so-called extra-parliamentary cabinet, the Dutch government, a government that's supported by 4 right-wing parties, has collapsed. So I guess I should frame this as a good week for the left and centrist parties in the Netherlands, but whether or not the left or centre will actually be able to capitalise on the government's failure or not, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I'm glad you're talking about this. I saw the news that the government had collapsed over there, but I've kind of been deliberately staying in the dark about why it's happened because I'm very lazy and I knew you'd be able to explain it to me on this podcast. So basically the only thing I know is that Geert Wilders, who's the Netherlands' kind of very own blonde far-right bogeyman.
We all have one.
We all have one. But it was him who walked away from the government and made it collapse, right?
Yes, that's essentially what happened. So Geert Wilders, if you don't know who he is, Google him. He will look exactly what you... Or don't even. He just looks exactly what you think he will look like. Another blonde far-right politician. He's a man who came to prominence by alienating Muslims, and he's a man who kind of behaves like a cartoon parody of a far-right populist politician. And he walked away because he'd had enough of trying to make this government work. So he pulled the plug. And I should say that this isn't really a surprising ending to the government. So in that sense, perhaps describing it as a dramatic week politically, which I think I did earlier, is slightly over-egging it. Everyone thought this government wasn't going to last. Actually, the fact that these parties managed to govern together for 11 months before imploding is a surprise for some. There were many, many arguments and many moments when it looked like the coalition might fall apart. And this time it actually happened. So the official reason for why Geert Wilders stepped away is because he was frustrated that not enough was being done about immigration in the Netherlands. The coalition agreement had promised the strictest asylum admissions regime and the most comprehensive package to gain control over migration ever. And Geert Wilders had the opportunities to make that happen. The Minister for Asylum and Migration was someone from his party, the PVV, after all. She's a woman called Marjolein Faber, and she wasn't able to achieve what the party wanted her to. She was seen by many political commentators as an incompetent minister. I actually saw a headline in one of the newspapers, the NRC, saying, "Is this the Netherlands' most incompetent minister of all time?" So that just gives you a taste of how much she is despised, at least in much of the media. But in many ways, it's being seen as a relief to a lot of people that she wasn't able to achieve what the party wanted her to achieve, because some of the ideas of her party on asylum are pretty extreme. So maybe that's a little thing to celebrate. She had, in fact, submitted a draft law for immigration earlier this year, but it had been criticised by the Dutch Council of State for its legal viability. Also criticised for the fact that they did not make plausible plans that would contribute to reducing the inflow of asylum seekers. And most damningly, it was criticised for being sloppily prepared, that draft bill.
Tut-tut.
Anyway, this is all to say that Wilders and his PVV pals had all the opportunities to try and pass the strictest asylum laws ever that they seem so desperate to do, but they didn't manage to do it in the 11 months that they stayed in power. And things came to a head last week when Geert Wilders stood in front of the press and announced a 10-step radical plan for immigration, including ideas like stopping all asylum applications, closing asylum centres, and using the army to guard the borders.
Wow.
Wilders was frustrated, essentially, that some other European countries had implemented some stricter policies to limit movement over the borders. That said, a lot of what Wilders was suggesting was extreme and went against international law, so maybe it wasn't ever going to be possible. What happened last week is that Wilders gave the party leaders from the other governing parties the chance to back all of these 10 policies he'd put together, to sign their name at the bottom of it. And if they wouldn't do that, he said he would leave the government. They didn't do that, and therefore he walked away.
Okay, so a kind of ultimatum. Bit of showmanship there.
Yes, exactly.
So a lot of this is about asylum policy, and definitely doesn't sound legal to me to just say like people who are fleeing war and persecution just can't claim safety in this country. That's not how we do things, is it?
Mm-hmm.
But like, out of curiosity, what are the refugee arrival numbers in the Netherlands actually like right now? Are they super, super high? Is that why it makes sense to be banging on about this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think he's mainly worried about refugees because it's the issue that gains him votes. The numbers of people coming into the Netherlands were very, very high a few years ago when Putin began the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the Netherlands welcomed huge numbers of Ukrainian refugees fleeing war. But actually, the numbers have been falling really steadily since 2022. The early data for 2025 seems to suggest that numbers of arrivals are continuing to decrease in the Netherlands, in part thanks to the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Fewer people from Syria are now heading to the Netherlands for safety. Although Frontex, the European border agency, say that the decrease is also due to stricter border controls. So that could also be playing a role. And look, there are real problems in the Netherlands that need urgent action from whoever is in power. For example, a housing crisis. But asylum seekers arriving are by no means the dominant or primary cause of that. And I think it's very difficult to argue that asylum seeker arrivals is the number one issue that needs fixing and the reason why a government should fall. As I said, I would argue that Wilders is just simply concerned about refugee numbers because he thinks it's politically convenient for him to make this the answer for all the problems in the country. Blame the foreigners. It's that old playbook. And I see it as a pretty manufactured crisis. Yeah,
oldest trick in the book, isn't it? What has this government... So they've been in power for 11 months now.
Yeah.
Apart from this, quote-unquote, sloppily drafted immigration bill, have they actually managed to achieve anything?
Yeah, they haven't managed to achieve a huge amount, to be honest. It was a very turbulent and difficult coalition forming process, and it continued to be difficult once they were in power. I've lost track of the number of public arguments these coalition partners had. Geert Wilders just loves getting into a Twitter fight and dissing his colleagues online.
Oh, one of those far-right people.
Yeah, exactly. You know the type. They did pass a budget that contained some cuts to higher education and an increase in defense spending, among some other tax changes. And they passed some draft laws, but yeah, in 11 months, not much can get done, at least in the Netherlands. Things move pretty slowly here.
I've noticed. Presumably there need to be some snap elections now that you don't have a government over there.
Yeah, although they're not going to be that snappy, thanks to the joys of Dutch bureaucracy. It seems like they won't take place until the end of October. So the cabinet and the prime minister stay in place now, but as a kind of caretaker government, and actually without the ministers of Geert Wilders' PVV party, because they were ordered by Wilders to step out immediately.
Okay, interesting that you mentioned the Prime Minister.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I know he hasn't been there for very long, but I feel like internationally we have barely heard from the Dutch Prime Minister over the last year. Like, what is his name even? Dick something?
Dick Schoof.
Where's he been amongst all of this drama?
Dick something. That should be the name of this episode. Yeah, well noticed. It really does say something that it takes this long into the good week for me to even mention Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof. He's a former civil servant, a former head of the spy agency, actually, and the coalition parties brought him in as a kind of non-political figurehead to lead this government because the other three coalition parties couldn't agree on appointing anyone from the largest party, the PVV, to lead the government because it was seen as too extreme and anti-democratic of a party. So they decided to go for this so-called extra-parliamentary cabinet, which ended up being a bit of a damp squib, to be honest, and not so extra-parliamentary. It's kind of just like a normal cabinet with a non-political figurehead. But yes, apparently Dick Schoof, our prime minister, read about the fact that his cabinet had fallen via a Twitter post from Geert Wilders.
Oh, that's not a good way to find out that news.
Yeah, so that shows like how he's being treated in all of this. And honestly, watching parliamentary debates over the last 11 months where Prime Minister Schoof had to represent the government in parliament was really tenenkrommend. That is the Dutch word for toe curling, because it was just really undignified. He'd give very hesitant speeches, and he would sometimes be undermined by his own coalition parties on Twitter whilst he was speaking. It's been, I think, quite an awkward relationship. And anyway, now he's having to actually try to work hard to mediate another argument, an argument between the three remaining coalition party members in his caretaker government. They're arguing about who will get the ministries that the PVV have abandoned, including that vital asylum and migration portfolio.
Oh, just for the next few months until the election?
Yes, well, you say just for the next few months, but it's about 5 months until the election, and then you know how long it takes for Dutch governments to usually actually get around to forming a coalition afterwards. So it could be a year that we are with this coalition government.
Fair enough.
It's also important to note that the Netherlands is hosting the NATO summit the week after next for the first time ever. So it's quite a busy time politically here. And I actually heard some political analysts saying that they think maybe Wilders chose this moment to pull the plug on the coalition because he didn't want to be in power during the NATO summit when the government are probably going to have to agree to spending billions on defence. He'd rather paint himself as a kind of anti-establishment opposition man instead of being involved in giving a green light to that huge defence spending. And yeah, what is very clear is that Wilders just wants to make the next 5-ish months before the election about immigration, just like he did at the last election. And therefore, he has been encouraging over the last few days a group of citizens in high-vis jackets who have been conducting illegal vigilante border checks on cars passing from Germany into the Netherlands. It's kind of quite scary stuff and a sign of a tumultuous few months ahead probably in this country. But I am making this good week for the opposition parties, so I should make that case as well. I think there is a risk that Geert Wilders has taken by stepping out of this coalition. It's pretty doubtful whether he will be able to achieve the extraordinary almost 25% of the vote that he achieved at the last election for his party, which, important sidebar, his party only has one party member officially. Him.
Oh.
Very nice and democratic.
Okay.
And I think there is a risk for him in this campaign that he is presented as an unreasonable man and someone who doesn't actually want to govern or fix any of the problems of this country now that he's stepped out of the coalition without much of a reason to step out.
I mean, what is his end game here? Like, did he walk away and make this whole thing collapse because he wants there to be new elections that end up with him being prime minister, even though you said there's a risk that actually does worse than before? Like, is that what he's playing at here?
Yeah, it could be that. And there were reports that he was very annoyed that he wasn't allowed to be prime minister this time around. But actually, if you look at his behaviour whilst in this coalition, it kind of looks like he doesn't want to be governing at all. Yeah. He has burned so many bridges with like all of his potential future coalition partners, and he's just proven that he is not someone you can negotiate with. For example, if you look at the Conservative Liberal Party, who've been working alongside him in this coalition, the VVD, their leader has already ruled out working with Wilders after the next election. And if they stick to that, it seems pretty difficult to imagine a path in which the PVV could be back in power unless they win an extraordinary number of seats. Dutch politics always requires compromise. There are almost always multiple parties involved in coalitions. And yeah, I honestly think Wilders is more suited to opposition, to simply position himself against things. He's really not a populist leader in the vein of like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who it seems actually really wants power in order to get things done. And honestly, that's why I think this week is potentially a good week for the centre and for the left, because it's, of course, too soon to say what will happen in the election, and everything can change. But because of Wilders' political tantrum, there is a chance that Wilders' far-right party will be out of power after this next election at the end of October. And that is good news for, not just for the centre-left people, but for people who believe in the rule of law, for people that believe that climate change is a real problem, for people that think what Israel is doing in Gaza is awful, for people that want anything to be done that will help with the housing crisis we have here. I think a lot of people should be thanking Wilders for his incompetence and for this political tantrum.
Thank you for being a giant baby man. So there's quite a few months to go until this election, but you have given this good week to the centrist and leftist parties. What are the polls saying right now? Like, who are the political leaders in the Netherlands who are hoping to come out of this election better off than they were in the government that just collapsed?
Yeah, well, before I talk about polls in the Netherlands, I should point out that in the Netherlands, the polls can change a lot during an election campaign, and that there are often like parties that just emerge and explode during a campaign and others that completely implode. So I really shouldn't get ahead of myself celebrating the end of Geert Wilders' reign in Dutch politics. Also because actually at the moment, his party are still polling as the biggest party, and they still really could gain power after the election. But they're sitting at around 19-20% according to polling averages, which is considerably below the almost 25% they reached at the last election. At the moment, there's something like a three-way tie for first place between the PVV, the conservative liberal VVD, who just ruled out working with them, and also the PvdA Green Left grouping. Now, this is two centre-left parties, the traditional Social Democrats and the traditional Green Left Party, and they are currently in the middle of the process of merging and are going to run together.
Interesting.
Now, that progressive super party is probably going to be led into the next election by former European Green Deal chief, Frans Timmermans. You might remember him if you're a big European Commission follower, which I'm sure some of our listeners are.
He was like one of the most charismatic people in sort of EU politics, though, over the last 10 years, though, no? Like, he was fun to listen to.
Yeah, he was. I think he's a really good talker, although he has this reputation here for being arrogant. I think maybe it's just because he's kind of clever and people like populists. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, it's possible that if they became the biggest party, that he could be a candidate for prime minister, although he's going to have to fight really hard for that to happen. It's also possible that Dilan Yeşilgöz could be the next prime minister. She's the leader of the conservative liberal VVD party, the one that's just ruled out working with Wilders. She was actually born in Turkey herself and migrated to the Netherlands as a child, but has, like so many centre-right politicians, been doing that thing of becoming more and more of an imitation of a far-right politician on a wide range of policy areas, including around immigration, also around how her party responds to Israel's war on Gaza. Her party actually voted against a motion last month that called for emergency aid to be delivered to Gaza. The Christian Democrats are also rising in the polls. That's the final party I'll mention. They have a really popular leader, one of the most liked political figures at the moment in the Netherlands, according to polls. He's a guy called Henry Bontebal. And yeah, he might be the kind of wild card in this campaign because he's finding some centrist space that's been left a bit absent by some other parties. And I read actually in an interview last weekend that he hasn't flown since 2006.
Wow.
That's how seriously he takes the climate crisis. So yeah, maybe he's going to be the wild card. I don't know. We have to see what happens. But I think all in all, it's a good week for opposition parties in the Netherlands who, thanks to this political crisis that Geert Wilders manufactured, now there's at least a glimmer of hope that the far right may have messed up their chance at power in the Netherlands and maybe locked out after the next election. Maybe?
Maybe. Interesting. Oh, I'm really looking forward to following the twists and turns over the next few months until those elections in October.
Yeah.
Dutch politics is more interesting than you think, you know?
Yeah, it is actually. I'm also looking forward to following the twists and turns and also bracing myself because 5 months is a long time.
Yeah. Good luck.
Thanks.